Hello, students. Welcome to Mr. Little's History Bites. And today we're going to be looking at chapters 13, part 2, and the expansion of Islam. Now, by the end of this history bite, you should be able to answer the following questions. Why was Islam appealing to so many converts? How did political changes encourage the spread of Islam? And how did economic factors encourage the spread of Islam? With that said, let's go ahead and dive right into the question of how Islam spread. And today we're going to look at 3 vectors of transmission, one being direct military conquest, the second being merchants and economic exchange as a medium of spread, and the third one would be via the work of Sufi mystics and missionaries who helped spread the religion via their work and travel. Let's talk a little bit about merchants, or people who do business and trade. Now, what you need to know is that by the time the Prophet had his revelations, Arabia was already the center of several major trade networks. This includes the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean trade networks. And the Prophet Muhammad himself was actually a merchant prior to his revelations from God. And so this gave merchants a sort of special, not literally a special position, but a sort of clout or acceptance within Islamic society that they may not have had in other societies. Merchants, by extension of the fact that they traveled to so many places, were a medium of transmission of this new religion, and they could encourage their peers to convert through several major incentives. One would be easier access to markets. If you were a common religion with someone, it makes you more willing to do a little bit of business with them, right? If you join this religion and maybe you learn the common language, which was Arabic, which was the common trade language within the caliphate, and then later on within several other areas. Additionally, merchants, or people who have money on their mind, so to speak, might be incentivized to convert with the notion that they don't have to pay the jizya. That's the tax on people who are not Muslims. That only applies within the caliphate, though, so that would not necessarily apply outside the caliphate. But merchants are credited with spreading Islam to many of the places it reached outside of immediate political control, such as East Africa, West Africa, South and Southeast Asia. And when we get to those areas, we'll describe in more detail how exactly that worked. Another way Islam spread was simply through direct military conquest. Now, the early caliphate fought its 2 largest neighbors, which were the Sasanian Persians and the Byzantine Empire, which was the successor to the Roman Empire. And they took a lot of territory from both of these empires. In the case of Persia, they conquered it outright. But it's important to understand that conquest did not mean instant conversion of the entire population. Egypt, for example, took hundreds of years to make majority Muslim, and it only became majority Muslim about 300 years ago. The capital of the caliphate moved out of Arabia to Baghdad, which is now, some of you may know, the capital of Iraq. But Baghdad, with its more central location within the Islamic world, also became a great center of trade and culture and art. But this meant that the heart of Islam moved out of Arabia and into parts of the world that it had not previously been. This conquest meant that you had to have military garrisons, and cities such as Cairo, which were originally military towns where Muslim soldiers would stay to keep away from everybody else, eventually became towns themselves. And Cairo, as some of you may know today, is the capital of Egypt and one of its largest cities. And so these are some of the ways that direct military conquest did convince others to join or made Islam look a little bit more appealing. It's also worth noting that the military victories of the early caliphates did convince many of the correctness of Islam. What you have to understand is that Islam's major, I don't want to say rival, but other religion that was competing for attention, which was Christianity, at the time was only 400 years old, and it was racked with internal divisions about the nature of Jesus of Nazareth, as well as questions of ritual. And so the division of Christianity versus the perceived unity of Islam did convince many that perhaps Islam was the correct religion to follow. And so this was embodied through their constant successful military conquests. And so maybe not so much the conquest itself, but what it seemed to symbolize was an incentive for many people to join what they perceived to be the correct religion. So the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is something called Sufism. Now, Sufism is a very broad term, and it refers to a movement of mystics and teachers whose single goal is to create a union with God. They want to unite with God. They want to make themselves one with God, right? And to do this, sometimes they reject the rules of Islam as laid down in the Quran and by religious leaders. This is collectively known as Sharia, in the quest of creating a union with God, right? And this may involve things like dancing and singing and poetry, meditation and reflection. The goal is, though, to live a life that will lead to a union with God, not to live a life that's a good life and then you die and go to heaven, but to live a life that will eventually allow one to transcend this life and become one with God. A very famous Sufi was a man named Al-Ghazali, who made Sufism easy to understand for average people, right? He talked about the ways in which an average person could follow Sufi teachings via daily meditation and daily reflection, right? He also critiqued the idea of scientific rationalism as a manner to know the divine. But this basically means is following rules and laws is not the way to God, according to Al-Ghazali. And so this idea that you could somehow litigate or make official rules that would lead to God was something you couldn't do, right? There was no way to know God except through union with God. And you can do this via meditation, reflection, dancing, singing, poetry, among other things. Now, Sufism is important mainly because it appealed to many non-Muslims in a way that perhaps the standard rule-based Islam could not appeal to non-Muslims. So, for example, Sufism has some similarities with Buddhism in that they both believe that this world that we live in right now is an illusion, right? And we should seek to escape it, right? Mystics from South Asia, referred to as Bhaktis, also focused on a union with God. And because Sufis were less concerned with the rules and more concerned with uniting with God and becoming one with God, right, they didn't have a problem with incorporating pre-existing ideas. For example, dancing. Sufis tended to incorporate local dancing traditions into their practices. This was not considered a bad thing or a problem. This also included incorporating sometimes pre-existing spirits or stories into their practices. And so because Sufism was so flexible, it is credited with helping Islam spread to several very particular places, such as West Africa, Kashmir, as well as Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. You may have heard of the whirling dervishes of Turkey, the people who dance and they spin around. Those are connected to Sufi mystics who believe this dancing brought them closer to God. And this is why Sufism is considered one of the vectors by which Islam spread, and one of the more important ones. So, military conquest, trade, and Sufi mystics are the three vectors we've talked about today. And so by the end of this history bite, you should be able to answer those essential questions. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.